I grew up in India and studied engineering as an undergraduate there before I left for the West. And I've spent a lot of my academic career in the West studying innovation in large corporations headquartered in Western countries. In more recent years, I've turned my attention to innovation in emerging economies, particularly India. And what I've learned has surprised me. Indian innovators, in contrast to their Western counterparts, seem to be unique in three ways. First, they're very frugal. They're very good at taking cost out of the entire innovation process. And this is possibly because they face severe constraints in their environment. Second, their mindset is very flexible. They're very good at improvising and often move from plan A to plan B to plan C. And maybe this is because their environment is very unpredictable. And the third thing is that many of their solutions are inclusive in that they're trying to bring people outside the formal economy into the formal economy. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Now, this is what we might regard as a typical innovation in an affluent society. This is a fridge that you can talk to and will talk back to you via the medium of this tablet, PC. And for that pleasure, you pay about $3,000. It's a rather expensive way to store your caviar. In India, in contrast, you're more likely to see something like this. This is a $30 fridge made entirely of clay. Doesn't need electricity, uses the cooling properties of water through clay to keep fruit and vegetables fresh for up to 5 days. Very frugal because it uses widely available materials like clay and water. The innovator behind this is highly flexible in his thinking, very good at improvising from how he got the idea to how he developed it to how he's commercialized it. And it's inclusive in that it's targeted at potentially hundreds of millions of people, not only in India but around the world, who would like to have a fridge but often can't afford one, or even if they can afford one, might not have access to electricity. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Here's another example. Now, this is what we would regard as a fairly standard incubator from a company like GE. It's about $20,000. It has all the bells and whistles. In the Indian context, where most people are in the countryside and hospitals cannot probably afford one like this or have a technician or even electricity to run it, something like this is more likely to be effective. This is a $200 baby warmer. Now, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it does 80% of the job, which is a very big problem in countries like India, that of infant mortality. When an infant is born 2 weeks premature and is not able to maintain his or her own body temperature, that infant might die, but this baby warmer can potentially save that infant's life. This was developed by a bunch of students at Stanford and is now being marketed in South India. They recently won the Economist Social Innovation Award for this. Now, I've studied scores of such inventions, innovations, and innovators in India, and when I've asked them how they would describe this frugal, flexible, and inclusive approach, even if they are foreigners like the Stanford people, they more often than not use this word jugaad. And so in our book, we give the book the title, Jugaad Innovation, and we describe this as the art of overcoming harsh constraints by improvising an effective solution using limited resources. And what we found to us delight is that this is not restricted to India, but many other emerging economies have their equivalents, and we see equivalents even in developed economies in the West. Now, why is this important to a country like India? I think we've heard during the course of the day that there are very large numbers of people in the middle class, and these are the people who are typically targeted by large companies, whether Western or Indian. These are in the cities and in the formal economy. But there are much larger numbers of people just below them in the economic pyramid, people who are aspirational, who may live in urban slums or smaller towns or in the countryside. They have low incomes, but increasingly they have some disposable income. And these are very large numbers of people and offer an untapped market because very few people have really systematically seen them as a market opportunity. And India, in some ways, is a microcosm for the rest of the world. The World Resources Institute estimates there are something like 4 billion people outside the formal economy around the world. These are people who earn less than $9 a day PPP. It's a very large market that the World Bank estimates is worth something like, at the moment, something like $5 trillion, which is about the size of the entire Chinese economy or 3 times the size of the Indian economy. And that's today. This is likely to be an even larger market in a few years' time. And why would the world, in fact, not just the developing world, but even the advanced world, be interested in frugal innovation? If we look at the West, over the last few years, there's been a sort of arms race in R&D with entire sectors like pharmaceuticals and automotive spending more and more money on R&D with less and less return. And they're seriously rethinking the way they do innovation, and in some ways they might have something to learn from their counterparts in emerging economies. We've also seen the alarming phenomenon of the hollowing out of the middle class in affluent societies. We see government budgets under constraints. And therefore, it's very likely that Western economies will be keen to learn from emerging economies how to do frugal, flexible innovation. Let me introduce you to some of the social entrepreneurs that I've studied who are behind some of these inventions and innovations I've talked about. This is Mansukh Bhai. This is the person behind the clay fridge. And he comes from a village in Gujarat. He has a basic high school education, but a very inventive, entrepreneurial person. Not only did he come up with this clay fridge, he's continued to innovate, has come up with non-stick frying pans, water filters using clay, and so forth. He has a factory in his village that employs a large number of women from the village. So not only is he producing products and services for low-income groups, but he's also providing employment for people in those communities. Here's another type of social entrepreneur from the South Indian city of Chennai. This is Dr. Mohan. He has more than a high school education, a very highly regarded diabetes specialist. He has a very thriving practice in Chennai, but he realizes that diabetes is a problem in the countryside as well. But there's a big problem. People from the villages cannot go or won't go to the city. It's too expensive for them to do that, to get treatment in his hospital. Neither will his city doctors go to the village, and certainly not live there. So he's come up with this quite ingenious jugaad solution of a mobile clinic that actually travels around the countryside. It's equipped with some fairly serious equipment, this and the satellite technology. And what happens is patients from the village will step into the van, look through the eyepiece. The image of the retina is then broadcast via satellite to the doctor sitting in the city, who can see it on his computer screen and make an instant diagnosis that he then relays back to a local health volunteer who then takes over. So very frugal, flexible, and inclusive model here. It's not just about technology, it's often about the entire system. Here's another example from Bangalore, South India, and this is Harish Hande, the founder and CEO of Selco, Solar Electric Lighting Company. Harish Hande's business offers solar lighting solutions to people outside the electricity grid, people in cities and in the rural, in the countryside. And his model, again, very ingenious. He selects and then trains people like this gentleman to run and maintain solar equipment, the panels, the batteries, the lights. Now, many people like this will not have bank accounts and therefore will not be able to get bank loans. So Harish Hande has worked with a bank to give loans to people like that, which he then guarantees initially. And with that loan, this person sets up shop. He buys the panels, the batteries that you see in his hand, and the solar lights, and then he charges them during the day, and in the evening he will rent them out at, say, 15 rupees a pop to people who might otherwise buy kerosene in that way. And so he offers a better quality light. If they have a business at home, they can work longer and increase their productivity and income. The children can read under this light. So there's a benefit to the end consumer, but there's also a benefit to people like this who get employment, get skills. After a while, they have a credit history, so he can withdraw his loan, and they are now in the banking system. Now, social entrepreneurs do wonderful things. They have ingenious solutions, but often they're constrained in the scale that they're able to achieve. So one looks for this kind of innovation in larger companies that can achieve the scale that's needed in countries the size of India. And of course, one large company that has very successfully applied some of the principles of jugaad, intending to be inclusive, to reach people who currently travel by motorcycle or scooter, taking their family and 2 or more kids through very precarious conditions in bad weather in places like Mumbai. This solution was intended to bring them into the formal economy, in a sense, and offer them an affordable but quality car. So that's an example of a lot of frugal and flexible innovation coming from a large Indian company. And the Tatas haven't stopped with the car. They've continued to try and do such frugal innovation in other contexts, such as this water filter, the Swachh water filter, which is about 1,000 rupees and retails both in urban and rural contexts. The Indian government isn't particularly known or associated with innovation, but from time to time they support innovations. And here is the then Education Minister, Kapil Sibal, supporting the Aakash tablet, which is a $35 tablet PC developed by a small company from a Canadian UK company called DataWind. And this is a big opportunity for a company like that. The intention here is to be able to give school children around the country access to a cheap means of accessing all the wonderful stuff that's on the internet, the Khan Academy and so forth, especially in a context where education is valued, but in a context where teacher absenteeism is very high. So being able to empower school kids around the country through cheap tablets, access to high-speed broadband, and the infinite material on the web is one way of solving India's huge educational needs. Multinationals have been getting into this space in a big way. Many of them set up large R&D centers in places like Bangalore and Hyderabad over the last 10 years, initially taking advantage of the relatively low cost but high skilled engineers and scientists that India produces every year, to work on projects led out of headquarters. But more recently, they've turned their attention to opportunities in the home market. And here is GE, which has a very large R&D center in Bangalore, doing innovation specifically for the Indian market, in this case, medical devices market. This is an ECG machine that they've developed specifically for India, for the context where doctors will typically go from the city into the countryside. And so if they're going to use an ECG machine, it would have to be radically affordable, portable, and run on batteries, not on AC. And so that's what they came up with. They've come up with this very affordable, portable ECG machine, and they've applied the principles of jugaad to do this. Instead of doing everything themselves and, in a sense, reinventing the wheel and then owning the IP, they decided to do what their Indian and Chinese competitors were doing, which is to take off-the-shelf components and then put them together to come up with this solution faster and cheaper. So they needed a printer. They looked around and they said, well, bus ticket printers will do very well. They took that component. They needed a keypad. They said, well, telephones have keypads. We can take that component and so forth. They put them together, applied a quality control standard, and they had this solution that was very successful in India. They had an equivalent in China, and now they have FDA approval and are selling these things in Western Europe and North America. Siemens also has a very large R&D center in Bangalore, and they've been doing their own innovation in the healthcare space, in medical devices. This is a fetal heart monitor that's much, much cheaper than ultrasound and much easier to use. It just uses radio technology, microphone technology. Nokia has been doing this kind of innovation for a long time in India, and this is an example of a very robust, affordable phone they developed specifically for people in Indian slums. Who would, when they bought a mobile phone, immediately cover it in plastic to protect it from dust and grime, and would use the light in the phone to see their way in the dark. Nokia, noticing that, built these features into the phone, a dustproof keypad and a built-in flashlight, and it's been a very big seller not only in India, but in other parts of the world as well. Let me end with some thoughts about jugaad in the West. What's been interesting to us since we published the book last year is the interest in doing this kind of frugal, flexible innovation in affluent economies, economies that have nevertheless been suffering the aftermath of the financial crisis. Here's an example of a group of students who graduated from Northwestern in Chicago. They call themselves Design for America, and when they graduated, they said, you don't need to go to Africa or Asia if you want to solve the world's problems. There are plenty in our American backyard. They started with Chicago, and with the problem of hospital-acquired infections, which affect something like 2 million people in the US alone, resulting in about 100,000 deaths every year. They went to a local Chicago hospital. They observed how doctors and nurses operate. They realized that these are people who care a lot about hygiene, but often do not have the opportunity to go to a wall unit to wash their hands between operations. So they went back to their studio and they designed this solution called Wype Sense. They came up with a prototype in their studio. It's something that just clips on. It's a dispenser. It's a gel dispenser. Just clips on to the doctors and nurses' scrubs, and they can wash their hands on the fly. And it even records this information, sends a signal to a wall unit, which stores that information, and then they can view it at the end of the day. They can see how they performed. And they did this very frugally, a small team doing what previously a very large team in a large company would have to do. Not only did they develop a prototype in their studio using 3D printers and the like, but they've also commercialized this without having large advertising budgets, merely using social media and TED Talks and so on to virally spread the message. I'm particularly proud of this example. This is a former student of mine, Eben Upton at Cambridge, who came up with this idea of a very cheap computer, $30 computer. His idea being, if we could make a computer so cheap that we could give one to every school kid in the UK, they could learn what goes into a computer, the hardware, and they could also learn coding, something that hasn't been done more recently and was done in the heyday of computers in the 70s. That was his vision. Since they introduced this, they've been overwhelmed by demand for this. Interestingly, not so much from school kids, but from perhaps their dads who are makers and want to tinker. And there are many applications that people now use a Raspberry Pi for, including things like meteorology. You can send one of these up with a little webcam in a balloon, and you can make observations of the atmosphere and so forth. And some of the ideas that people are learning from emerging markets are being brought back to the West. This is Jeff Immelt of GE, who's gone on record as having said that he expected some of the healthcare products developed in India to be exported to the rest of the world. He thinks that some of them have applicability in the US and Europe. So let me conclude by saying that I strongly believe that this kind of frugal, flexible, and inclusive innovation is important, not just for countries like India, but really for the world. I strongly believe that the UK and the West can work with their counterparts in India to do this kind of innovation, and that together we can improve lives everywhere. Thank you.